My name is Miseenoha. I'm based in Brooklyn in the US, and my practice looks at what happens when you try to fit the world into data and the power, relationships, and dynamics that are behind that. For how we make meaning, I'm doing my favorite thing, which is using technology to talk about non technical things. So I'm showing a bunch of different works. One of them is called The Future is Here. That's this moving image piece about the places where machine learning labor happens in the global south. And it's kind of a consideration of why those places aren't part of the narrative of things we associate with AI. There's In Absentia 2.0, which is in conversation with work that the Black sociologist W.B. Du Bois did over a century ago, which also was very data driven. And that piece addresses the difficulties he faced and the pitfalls that he fell into himself. There is Us Aggregated 3.0, which is interested in the ways that any of us who use the internet become randomly put into new groups, and that creates these strange and new versions of us that we actually don't have very much control over. There is A People's Guide to AI, which is work completed in collaboration with Diana Nucera. And that one is probably the most educational, really, of all of them. And that is a comprehensive beginner's guide to understanding AI and other data-driven systems. But it uses a popular education approach and is very much created by two artists. And so a really creative way a creative way for thinking about those things. Well, today, AI is basically used as a synonym for machine learning, which is really just one branch of the field in which computers generate rules and predictions without being explicitly programmed. But in general, I think AI is an interesting term to me because it's kind of hard, because it also is this catch-all for really any computer systems that can do or perform tasks that we think would normally require human intelligence. And that's interesting because our benchmark for what tasks require human intelligence is constantly changing as computers are able to do more things. And so that moving goal is what makes AI so interesting to me, because it means that what happens is that the term sort of represents something different than what the definition really is. And I always find that to be interesting when there's a gap between those things. And so I'm just very fascinated with teasing apart, why is that? Okay, well, what is the narrative? Who does it really affect? How is it tied to existing ways that we've known the world? What is really new here and what isn't? I think I'm inspired by a lot of things. In some ways, I'm inspired by just a lot of the communities that I'm a part of and looking at the ways in which people who I know use or don't use digital and technical things, and why it is that way. But then I'm also really inspired just by my own background, being Nigerian, being Igbo, and thinking about me as somebody who has had to move a lot of times, and my family needing to move in the world, and trying to make sense of why that is. What are the forces that make us move or do different things? I'm really, really inspired by basically anybody who's trying to do work in the world to change it in some way and make it different, and focusing really intensely on that. And so that can be really anything. I mean, like musicians, I mean authors, I mean I don't know, even like people dancing on the street. I don't know, all sorts of things. And then, like, conceptually, I'm probably the most inspired by the writing of Sylvia Wynter, which I adore because she is someone who is in so many different fields. And I think so much of my work is about trying not to be in just one place and looking at the connections between different fields. So I really also like her.
My name's Memo Acton, and I'm from Istanbul, Turkey. Where I'm based, that should be a simple question to answer, but unfortunately it's not. I am from Turkey. I lived in the UK for the last 20 years, but I've been traveling since 2018. I left the UK 2 years ago, and I was just about to move to Southern California in March of 2020. And as we all know, a global pandemic hit. So I've been unable to go, and I'm currently stranded in a quite beautiful remote fishing village in the Turkish Mediterranean while I wait for the US consulate to reopen. So I can't complain. Regarding my practice, very broadly speaking, I am ultimately interested in trying to understand the world, trying to understand and make sense of our position in the world and the human condition. And specifically, I focus on working with emerging technologies, particularly computational and algorithmic approaches as the tools and the lens and the medium to create moving images, compositions, small and large scale responsive installations and performances. The work I'm showing is called Deep Meditations, a brief history of almost everything in 60 minutes. It's a large scale, immersive, very slow and meditative video and sound installation. I like to think of it as a monument that celebrates life, nature, the universe, and our subjective experience of it. It is a very abstract film that over the course of 60 minutes takes us on a journey through the birth of the cosmos, the formation of the planets and rocks and the seas and the spark of life, evolution, the formation of ecosystems, the birth of humanity, civilization, settlements, culture, history, war, art, ritual, worship, religion, science, technology, everything. And most crucially, everything is told through the imagination of an artificial deep neural network trained on hundreds of thousands of images that I scraped from Flickr. And these aren't images that are of a particular data set, like trees or cats or dogs, but they're very abstract concepts that I searched Flickr for, things like God, faith, worship. And of course, these concepts don't have very clearly defined objective visual representations. Instead, I ended up training the neural network on hundreds of thousands of images that represent what we humans collectively think that these concepts look like. And this is a very, very, very diverse data set because it's hundreds of thousands of opinions of individuals. And all of this goes into the deep neural network, which is a kind of a melting pot that tries to make sense of all of this data in its own computational way and spews out these abstract amalgamations. And then we look at the outputs and we project back what we see based on who we are. And ultimately, what this project is about, and what a lot of my work these days is about, is reflecting on the idea that both artificial neural networks and the biological neural networks inside our skull see things not as they are, but as we are. So artificial intelligence means quite a few different things to different people. And to me, it means all of them, actually. There's the most obvious, which is I think what AI means to most people, most of the general public, which is probably kind of steered by sci-fi. And, we think of robots, we think of Blade Runner, Terminator, Westworld. We think of basically robots. And we could think of it as the dream of AI. But if we dig into that angle quite deeper, we reach the birth of the field of AI almost a century ago, which is actually tackling a question which is thousands of years older than that, which is trying to understand the mind. And what AI ultimately is a discipline born about a century ago, which is trying to tackle this issue from a new perspective, which is a computational perspective. So in essence, it's trying to understand the mind through hypothesizing, designing, building, and testing computational models of cognition. This is the AI that was born, as I said, about a century ago. But even at its birth, there were two motivations behind the birth of AI. One was this, which is the philosophical angle. And then the other was military, which is if we can build computational models of the mind, if we can build intelligent systems, how can we use these systems as a society to our benefit, which often is at the disadvantage of opposing societies or communities. And so the AI that we have today, the technology that we have today, is very much focused on the latter. It is not necessarily only military, but it is definitely a surveillance technology. It's a technology which is designed to make sense of big data. The field of AI that is very dominant today, called deep learning, which is where we're seeing all of these breakthroughs, is ultimately a surveillance technology. It is the field of interpreting big data to extract meaningful information from it. I'm mostly inspired, as I mentioned, by trying to understand the world and the human condition. I'm inspired by nature. And when I say nature, I don't mean only trees and flowers and the countryside, though definitely that too, but I mean the phenomena that gives rise to everything around us. And I mean everything. So that includes the trees and the flowers, but it also includes the nuclear fusion in the heart of the sun, which releases the energy from the mass of the hydrogen atoms, and it sends the UV rays down to the trees and the flowers on Earth, which in turn turns them into fuel, which fuels all of life around us. So I'm fascinated by trying to understand phenomena and using computational models as a language to try and make sense of it all.
Yeah, my name is Tom K. Kemp. I'm based between the UK and the Netherlands. I'm an artist, and I primarily work with role-playing game design. So role-playing games are not like video games. It's more like a tabletop situation, and they're kind of this way of collectively generating stories together that are kind of moderated or made unexpected by game rules. And I use these games to create, as I said, collaborative fictions with groups of players in order to tell unpredictable stories about complex systems and their affects. So I'm exhibiting a film installation of mine called Napoleon Complex. It's a work that explores weather modeling algorithms and how they're used by global catastrophe insurance. And it uses various methods, including role-playing game design and animation and kind of non-linear filmmaking, to speculate on the consequences of creating weather modeling algorithms at a series of different scales, from the economic to the intimate. And I made the film with an actuarial scientist, so that's somebody who works with financial risk management, and as a job they build simulation models of global catastrophes out of statistics, and the kind of statistics and the data they use include things like the amount of damage done to buildings by storms in the past, but also very, very minute pieces of information like the behavior of atmospheric molecules at certain times of the year. And they kind of compile all of this data into models of potential kind of storm areas around the world. And that's used to define things like how expensive certain areas of the world are to insure or reinsure, and the kind of value of land and those sort of things. So the film tries to kind of explore the consequences of those decisions, and through a series of scenes in the film, which are devised and sort of improvised through role-playing game that we're playing, the kind of details of this job and the process of this profession become complicated and sort of revealed to be kind of non-impartial through the kind of addition of tangential personal information and the kind of exploration of the business side of this process, and then the idea being that this kind of objective impartial status that kind of algorithmic modeling and statistical simulation has, generally speaking, in this case, is sort of like incorrect, and that these processes have kind of global consequences on both a national and personal level in terms of things like land value, house prices, and investment in local infrastructure, that kind of thing. And then I work a lot in my work with sort of genre fiction and situating these like areas of research within different types of genre. And I would say this film is kind of intended to sit within a sort of weird, with a capital W, fictional genre, and kind of emphasize these qualities along with the way the film was edited, both within the film and within these kind of satellite screens that are around the film. You'll see this kind of mutant emperor moth hatching and kind of flying towards the film set, which is meant to kind of emphasize the kind of unnatural qualities of the process that we're talking about. Yeah, artificial intelligence is a really big tent of a term, and I'm not specifically a technologist, but I think there are a couple of things that are kind of interesting and important for me. And firstly, that I guess a lot of the time when we're talking about artificial intelligence, there's this model of the neural network, which is this way of feeding sets of data to a series of algorithms in order to like help it create very specific kinds of informed decision making. And I think that's quite an interesting process, because even if you manage to string together lots of these neural networks into something that might approximate forms of human decision making, they're still always extremely biased by the data that is being fed to them. And even if they're also kind of given this status of being objective or impartial or kind of correct or fair in the way that they function. So there's this assumption, right, that like this way of like managing data sets and generating things is very like fair or neutral or kind of impartial. But actually, frequently when you feed things like neural networks as very specific sets of data, the results that they produce are completely weird and kind of reveal a form of decision making that doesn't feel like a human form of decision making, which maybe some people say is very efficient, but it can also kind of like be used to reveal the kind of inherent flaws or strangeness of our ways of collecting data and organizing information, particularly in relationship to like statistical and categorical analysis. So when you see like a weird deep dream image generated by a neural network, that's almost like an incorporation of, in my opinion, of some of the kind of inherent strangeness and mutation of like the collection and categorization of data in the first place. And then secondly, I think as we create these sort of technologies whose decision-making processes are increasingly opaque and independent from us, they're these black boxes, so we can't really unpick how they decided to do what they've done. We're able to experience and experiment with like the notion of other minds, non-human or post-human minds. And while these have arguably existed in the realms of like flora and fauna forever, the development of like artificial intelligence like processes may be seen as a kind of step in a broader process of like repositioning the primacy of human agency and within the kind of ecosystem that we function, and sort of thinking about how humans and kind of post-human minds or non-human minds can be involved in decision making and action at like different scales. So as the writer, as someone interested in fiction, I'm very inspired by weird fiction, as I mentioned. So that's people like going all the way from people like Lovecraft to a more kind of contemporary field of people like Jeff and Anne Vandermeer, M. John Harrison, K.J. Bishop. And weird fiction is often like a sort of science fictional or paranormal type of story in which the protagonists engage with and are impacted by systems or phenomena or entities that have a scale and an agency far beyond that of the human or even kind of our planetary scale. And I'm kind of interested in those stories in terms of how they can work as a sort of political analogy for the relationship between individual experience and the kind of vast and interconnected globalized complexity that we encounter and face. maybe very pressingly at the moment with the pandemic and how that relates to globalized systems. And those kind of influences I try and infuse into the work that I make and the subjects that I address. And then more formally, and in terms of my actual kind of methodology, I'm very influenced by theories of like post-cinematic filmmaking and like affect-based cinema. So that's someone like Stephen Shaveiro. So thinking about like the formal qualities and the sensory qualities of contemporary video making and how they make you feel on like an affective level, which is where a lot of my thinking around editing and animation comes in, and also the kind of improvised game-based kind of performance that I try and evoke. And then kind of all of that stuff I try and use to think through systems thinking and like complexity modeling, and how there is a need for that, but there's also a kind of danger within that in terms of abstracting things or de-specifying things or kind of removing the detail from things. And I think there I'm kind of interested in writers like James Bridle or Patricia Reed, who are sort of technologists to an extent, but they're also deeply concerned with the subjective as well.